Nitin, hi, good to have you with us. How have you been?
Hi, Ashu. Wonderful. It's been brilliant. Can't complain.
you know, Nitin, I am particularly looking forward to this conversation, right? I think given with what's happened in the in the digital brand space, right? The massive disruption that has happened. I mean, who would have thought, you know, uh, of course, COVID has been difficult, right, for each one of us, but I think it's been a phenomenal accelerator for many D2C brands. I think the kind of adoption that we've seen in the last 1.5 years has been absolutely phenomenal. And I think that's just given so much confidence to the market, right, in terms of going out and creating brands which can survive purely on digital engagement, right? Something which we I think which was difficult to sort of comprehend and I think even imagine, right, in a pre-COVID sort of environment.
Yeah, that is absolutely right. And I think the crux of it, while the COVID has provided the impetus to the brands, impetus where brands are able to reach more and more consumers as
Right.
more and more consumers have come and shopped online. And I think just before COVID itself, last 5 years, there has been huge innovation in the industry. I think
Right.
historically, when you look at brands being created offline, one of the big challenges companies faced was every time a large company would innovate a product on a retail shelf space, because shelf space was limited, they had to replace one product to put another product, right?
Right.
And now
Right.
the shelf space is literally the search result on Google, Facebook, Instagram, etc.,
Right.
etc. So it's an unlimited shelf space, right? And that's literally the impetus which the brands are getting. And as
Right.
more and more consumers become digital native and digital first consumers, I think there's a huge ecosystem which will continue to grow for the next decade and couple of decades.
Phenomenal. Then before we dive into I think that's a very interesting point and narrative that you brought out, right? I think, but before we dive into all of that, I would love you to take me through your journey, right? I mean, you've been a professional for a fairly long time, right? And Global Bees being the latest baby, right? That you're nurturing, and in a great way. I think we've this is there's been a lot written about it, and we'll dive more deeper into that, and various aspects of what you're trying to solve with that. But if you could give me a quick rundown of your of your professional path, career path, I think that'll be a great starting point.
Yeah, so it's been 20 years, literally 21 years in the career, to be honest, now. I started my career as in banking with Citibank, and then I think after that, I spent literally 15 years in the startup world. I co-founded a company with my co-founder Supam, who's now the founder of First Track, who's also an anchor investor with us,
Right.
Brainweaver Technologies, which is a services company. Went on to build early part of e-commerce ecosystem, uh, built out a fintech ecosystem with Bhupi, who's the MD at Deutsche Bank, last stint with Edelweiss, and now back to a startup world. So literally, out of the 22 years of experience, I think I've spent about, say, 5 years in a large organization and rest 15 years in building the large organizations.
Very interesting. Nitin, I mean, there's so much happening in the fintech ecosystem. And, you in a way, you are, of course, with GlobalBees, the construct of GlobalBees, right? I think, you're kind of investing in brands, right? But I mean, typically everybody who's touched the financial ecosystem, right, or financial services ecosystem, right, has been creating something or the other, right? And you've taken a completely different path, right? What made you do that?
Well, see, incidentally, last 4 years when I moved into a financial services ecosystem, people ask me the same thing. You've been a startup technology world. What are you doing in a financial services ecosystem? And I think
Interesting.
now the question is the other way around. The way I look at it is, as you gain experience across various parts of the industry, I think every part of the industry teaches you something new, and you become a holistic individual, and that
Right.
is a great enabler to create big brands or big businesses. I think the context of experience of a vertical can be easily learned. I think the experience you get from a varied ecosystem is fairly massive and
Right.
fairly unique.
Right. Very interesting. And then, coming to GlobalBees, right? I think and given what like we discussed right at the outside of the conversation, right? I think it's been an absolutely phenomenal surge of D2C brands, right? I think the way they're kind of shaping up, the way I think the way they're getting institutionalized, for example, and the kind of capital movement that we've seen has been absolutely phenomenal, right? And I think the new concept which is kind of emerges essentially household brands, right? Which also in a way is what GlobalBees represent, right? But that's my understanding at a certain distance, right? I would love you to run me through the construct of GlobalBees, right? In terms of how it's designed. One, Second, what are some of the key priority areas? And third, when you're looking to engage with many brands out there, right? How do you essentially look to, how will that relationship play out as you go along?
Okay, so there are a lot of angles to the GlobalBees story. I think one I've already talked about in terms of how we've seen the brands innovation pace in the past,
Right.
and what D2C brands are doing is literally innovating. But if you look at the India ecosystem in particular, I think brands also have a certain scale limitation on individual
Right.
level. So in India, when you look at a product, I think there are great product innovation that continue to happen. People talk about entrepreneurship. India has always been about entrepreneurship.
Right.
There are only 2% people or 4% people who pay income tax. Rest are entrepreneurs, right? So it's
Right.
literally a land of entrepreneurs where 98% of the population is some sort of entrepreneur or otherwise. But individually, if you look at the brands out of the businesses, about million businesses which would get created every year, I think there are only 10,000 businesses which will reach a scale of 10 crores, and 1,000 which will reach a scale of
Right.
50 crores, and a 500 which will reach 100 crores, and only 10 which will reach a 500 crores, and so on and so forth.
Right.
And a standalone value beyond a point, the experience which is required, the expertise, the infrastructure which is required at every scale of this brand is very different.
Right.
And if you look at even a large consumer company portfolio, any of the consumer companies you look at, Marico's, Imamis, they are all great companies, the HLL and P&Gs and Dabas of the world. The
Right.
individual brand on each of these portfolios are not literally, I mean, there are some brands which are 1,000 crores, but individual brands are not 1,000 crores.
Mhm.
There are very few brands which are 1,000 crores. But
Right.
however, creating unique 100 crore, 150, 200 crore brands are more sustainable in a portfolio approach from a
Right.
longer term perspective, and that is literally the idea of GlobalBees. We
Right.
look at the brands which have created that product market fit, literally created that niche, and then as a sustainable brand, how they can make the journey as a part of a portfolio rather than standalone. And that's the vision of GlobalBees. GlobalBees provides a unique advantage when you talk about a growth story, the tech platform, the marketing platform, the operations platform, supply chain, sourcing, manufacturing, international expansion.
Right.
So we bring all these expertise, we bring all these platform also from the experience of our anchor investor, which is First Craft, and literally are able to sustain the brand much longer, create a much healthier brand story, and create a larger runway for the brand and make them a global brand. And that's literally the vision of global business.
Fantastic. Before I come to more into the market side, questions, right? And I have quite a few, right? I mean, because India is a market of complexities, right?
Yes.
And of course, you like you mentioned, right? I mean, there's just about 2% of the people who are paying taxes, right? And of course, D2C is a concept which is a very urban market in many ways. And like I said, at a distance there could be, this assumption could be flawed for certain categories, right? And I would love to discuss more with you on that, right? But Nitin, at what stage? I mean, tell me the process of engagement, right? With when you want to identify some of these companies, right? What is the process of that? At what stage do you like to enter, right? I think that's number one. Number two is that there are many products that are coming up, right? Especially that's a trend which is picked up in the last 1.5 years, right? Because people have been exposed to content in a very different way, right? They're willing to try because of disposable incomes being high, especially in urban markets, right? But these are brands that will actually build super niches, right? And but then they're going to be very interesting value niches that are going to get built, right? What's your thesis around that? I mean, these are not brands which will possibly go on to, like you said, right, 100 crore sort of a top line, right? These are going to be brands, but they're going to be extremely thick when it comes to profitability and consistency of use. Right? What are your thoughts around that?
Again, few angles on that. Number
Sure.
one, brands we look at which can create a sustainable global play. So our area of operation, not just India, how we can take brands international, what is the impact they can create. But we look at that unique product market fit, which is differentiated, and those
Okay.
differentiation can happen from a product innovation, can happen from the product positioning. Product positioning can come in from how the brand is positioned, how
Right.
pricing is positioned. So there has to be something unique. And I just like to counter saying these are urban plays. What we have seen actually is a lot of brands which are not just urban plays, and there are great platforms which are coming, which are addressing these plays. When you look at somebody like a Misho, somebody like
Right.
a Deal Share, like Oda, they are actually going. These are the new GT channels or a
Right.
digital first GT channels, right?
Right.
So it's not necessary that we look at all these brands as an urban play. I
Mhm.
think we are seeing very interesting niche where even on tier two, tier three, or hinterlands of the India, we are seeing the brand unique value proposition being created, and we
Mhm.
look at all those unique plays in the brands to attract. I think from a scale perspective, if that was a question, we typically look at brands who are, million, couple of $1 million at least on a run rate basis. We can go up to right up to $15 million on a run rate basis. So those
Mhm.
are the ranges we look at. But I think for more importantly, our perspective is what can GlobalBees to do
Mhm.
to make the brands a 10x in 3 years. I think that's our single point agenda.
Right.
We look at the brand, we look at our ecosystem, we look at our distribution strength, and we say, can we make it 10x in 3 years? Can
Mhm.
we grow that profitably in 3 years? And I think that's our main decision criteria on how we look at it.
Right.
So while you can say it's a super niche category in terms of scale, but when you look at a global aspiration of global bees, I think we are able to create that impact.
Very interesting. Yeah, I mean, when I look at the construct, right, in terms of the process that you run with the startup, right, it's exactly same, very similar to that of a fund, right? But and there is but there is a very key differentiation, right? When you're operating it as a fund, you're essentially you kind of invest and then you are essentially you know more on the you give founders that space to sort of go out and operate, right? But I think the construct of GlobalBees is where you actually are sort of you've brought in and you're building this great team, right, of incredible professionals, right, who come in and will actually be working very closely, with the founders, right, with the founding teams to sort of go out and achieve those milestones and stuff like that, right? Uh, you know, is this a choice which is being made very consciously? I mean, which is the role that you play, right? I mean, is this that of a fund? Is this that of an operating partner?
Okay,
Once you funded,
let
what's
me
going to be the
clarify
journey from there
that.
on? Yeah,
Yeah, let me clarify that. So
sure.
our decision-making process or a due diligence process is maybe looks similar to a operating fund,
Right,
but on every other aspect, we're very different. So
right.
when you look at an investment thesis, you look at any fundraising document of a company.
Mhm.
Typically, their fundraising requirements, the large part of fundraising requirements happens for working capital. So
Right.
you're essentially diluting equity for working capital.
Hmm.
Then you have investments in tech that you need to do. Then you have investments in people, senior
Right,
people, the investment in warehouses, the investment in the whole supply chain. Now,
right,
the idea when we come in, this whole thesis in terms of the amount of funds which are required and amount of funds that will be the equity that needs to be diluted from that fund perspective, we are able to bring that as an ecosystem itself, right?
right.
So our idea of alignment with the founders is saying, and no founder, to be honest, I mean, we've talked to so many founders, they all
Right,
are passionate about the product, but
right.
every time I ask the question saying, how much time do you spend on the passion?
Mhm.
And they literally spend less than 10% of the time on the passion of developing the product.
Right,
Because 90% of the time, they start spending on hiring people, building tech, supply chain, some COD order not getting delivered, talking to the logistics player,
right,
and so on and so forth. And we, as a platform, are able to take away all those operating,
right,
nuances. So the founder is able to focus on the brand. Founder is able to focus on a core value proposition of the brand, and that's literally becomes a win-win situation for both. So while
right.
the process of evaluation may be different, but a fund would rely on a lot of expertise of the founder and founding team to grow the brand from here. I think we would rely on an own team with the founder saying what we can do together.
Right.
So I think that's a big difference on the choices that the founder is making.
Very interesting. Nitin, I have a bunch of questions on that. I'll just come to that in just a bit, right? I mean, you mentioned about global aspirations that you have at GlobalBees, right? And I think that it's captured in the name as well, right? Of the entity, right? Uh, which are the key markets, Nitin, that you're focused on?
Well, generally we're focused on large enough markets where brands can create a sustainable presence, at least a market where individually the brands can create at least $10 million sort of a revenue in the
Right.
markets. But we're
Hmm.
literally looking at across the continents. We are currently in Southeast Asia. Oceanic region.
Right.
We already have a presence. We're looking at Greater Europe, not
Hmm.
just the smaller Europe of UK and Germany. We're looking at Greater Europe,
Right.
America. So it's across the board. To be honest, we are not limiting our thinking and aspiration to any part of the globe specifically. I think that's what the great digital ecosystem provides. I think every
Right.
country where the demand of a consumer is getting concentrated on top two, three digital native players in every country.
Hmm.
It's easier to get into a country and a geography and to be able to spread that demand or cater to that demand.
Very interesting. Nitin, I was recently in a conversation, right, with a D2C founder and somebody now who also invests in D2C companies, right? And there was a very interesting conversation that was happening, right? And his thesis was, right, that we are investing in many opportunities that are emerging in India, right? Because that essentially, given the large market that we are, right, and given the complex nature of the market, it's a very interesting play, right? It just helps you understand product at many levels, right? And then you can pick up certain combinations, and then you can start looking at the export possibilities around that particular brand, right? But his thesis essentially was built around anchoring it in India, right? Given that they've operated in India, they understand that market, right? Cost of acquisitions, for example, are phenomenally low, right, in a market like this. Is that a similar thesis, or are you looking at companies that are already operating in those geographies, right? And then that becomes a very different kind of an investment play that you look at, right? Or are you looking at one region where you tend to or intend to pick up companies from, and then look at global markets in terms of saying that this is something which could be fitted into this market, right? And there's a country thesis that sort of then comes into the play, right? What's the mechanics of this play? I mean, what's the playbook like?
Yeah, so we are essentially looking at brands which are anchored in India, which have created that unique position play in India.
Sure.
Not as necessarily 90% of our brands that we are working with do not have international presence,
Hmm.
but it's our own team and our own experience in the global markets
Right.
which helps us, evaluate for each brands in terms of what we can do with the global perspective from these brands,
Right.
and that's the ecosystem that we bring. We necessarily don't look at brands existing presence to be in India. I think we're ranking our brands, only in India at this point.
Very interesting. Nitin, there are models like Thrasio, right, which are, which we see, right, have been extremely heavily funded, right? They've acquired a lot of companies. I mean, the portfolio is kind of swell, right? They exactly have a very similar play plan, right, or playbook, and a thesis, right? They're now looking at other markets, right, where they can grow these companies that they've, that are part of their portfolio in, right? And we will start to, I mean, given what we've seen, right? I think once things start to normalize, we'll see a lot of that movement happening from such geographies, right? There could be, international players from the US and Europe, we start looking at India market because, India for some reason has become extremely predictable, right? At least in the urban areas. I mean, the Bharat version of it is still kind of, we still need to build a little more clarity around it, right? I mean, we're still struggling with, some, complexities in that area, right? But we'll start to see that, right? I mean, what's your sense of it? What do you make out of it, right? Is this going to be a very different kind of a competitive environment, right? Until recently, till the time the house of brands concept didn't necessarily come through, right? There were smaller people fighting out for smaller, markets, right? But here now the appetite is going to be very different, right? What do you make out of a situation of this sort?
Yeah, so I think there are a lot of differences in India adoption.
Sure.
Globally, there have been platforms which have been available, and if you look at global platforms making impact of India, they would be fairly limited in that
Right.
sense. So India becomes a very different, different complexity, different sizes, different unit economics from that perspective. So
Right.
we feel very confident in terms of if anybody needs to do business in India, local context. Of acquiring brands or working with the ecosystem is required. And to that extent, I think we understand that ecosystem. However, we don't know how other players or global players which are going to come and play
Right.
in India. The big difference between global players and operating in India is already a large manufacturing hub, right? There is a large
Right.
manufacturing which happens in China, but there's also a fairly large manufacturing which happens in India. And when you start
Right.
acquiring the brands on a ecosystem which is manufacturing on own, there are
Hmm.
different kind of skill sets which are required. There are different kind of ecosystem plays you need to do,
Right.
and different kinds of evolution that you need to do, and that is very important to understand. Also, India, from a demand generation perspective, every state is a country, to be honest.
Correct.
And that itself, it's like Europe, right? I mean, if you
Right.
put the whole Europe together, India is literally like that. It's not every state is a country in that sense.
Right.
So India has very different complexities in that sense, and we've seen it in the past. In whether you talk about financial services technology, whether you talk about e-commerce, whether you talk about models like Misho or Trade or any of the startups, I think India has created its own niche in every of those players, and we feel fairly confident that India, from that perspective, will be driven by Indian models rather than a global adoption of global models, because that way India is fairly unique in that sense.
Right. Very interesting, right? I mean, when you're of course saying this, I'm kind of, thinking of certain nuances that
It's
could be
very
an option.
simple, right? If you talk to Therasio of one of their first acquisition, which is the pet odor remover, right? That company is
Right.
a $20 million company. Now, a
Right.
pet odor remover market size in India itself is not $20 million. So
Right.
can you take a niche product which is just a pet odor remover and make it a large
Right.
organization? I think it needs to be looked at very differently.
Nitin, you walked into a very interesting question. You've actually literally walked into a very, very interesting question, right? Um, and this is a question I was possibly looking to answer at a later point. Sorry, a question at a later point, right? But I think it couldn't be better timed, right? Uh, Nitin, one thing that we've seen, right? COVID has been extremely unreal, right? But I think one thing that did was, of course, there was a huge tech adoption that we see. There's a huge digital adoption that we see, right? But I think what it did was, and I think this is something we're extremely excited about, right, as a possibility, is that it's reduced the arbitrage that existed between certain cities, right? Because there has been literally been it's just kind of weeded out all the physical infrastructure which was required to say deliver a certain service or a product or whatever, right? And I think that's something that we're seeing in the D2C adoption category as well. What has happened on the consumer side is that we are essentially into uncharted territories, right? Because the everybody's consuming content from wherever, right? The influence is very, very different, right? There's a certain sense of homogeneity which is now kind of coming, right? Do you think that we are essentially kind of transcending into being a larger homogeneous market, right? Something that America is. We've always aspired to be, right? And like I said, right? I mean, there is a lot more English content which is getting consumed, right? Gen Zs and the newer generations are kind of there's a certain sense of homogeneity coming in, right? Because larger interaction is essentially happening through tech, right? What's your sense of where we are? What are we going to be as a market, right? In the next 1 or 2 years, right? Are we going to be a very homogeneous, predictable market, or are we going to, with this information that is now available to us, we're going to be extremely iffy on our and unpredictable on our demands, right? The product life cycles are going to be much shorter, right? I think organizations, companies in the D2C space or any other space will have to optimize for that, uh, you know, uh, very quickly changing environment, right? A very dynamic environment.
So I think that environment will be dynamic. Environment always has been dynamic, and as the innovation spreads and more new startups will come in innovation, I think for every company it's important to keep innovating, and that's
Mhm.
very, very important thing. I think I'll just go back to your questions of homogeneity. I don't think the ecosystem is becoming less or more homogeneous. E-commerce today in India it's still a sub 2% market. There is a
Right,
90% market which continues to be offline,
right,
and I think more and more those consumers have not changed from their pattern of consumption and how look at the brands.
right.
Another example I would give you, if you look at the consumption patterns of any social media platform into a
Hmm.
local language. Even Amazon today has launched multiple local languages.
Right,
I think that itself proves saying it's not that the consumer is changing and everybody is becoming English. I think we're sitting in the cities tend to assume that everybody is now speaking English and everybody is buying the same product.
right,
But I think larger India is very, very different.
right,
Brands have realized that whether it's social media platform like Facebooks of the world or share chat and everything, if you look at the consumption of local content, it's
right,
continuously increasing. And I think brands needs to understand, while every brand has been a digital first or English first in terms of their communication, I think the local communication, the nuances of a greater India has to be addressed to build out a sustainable ecosystem. And that's going to be continued important. I think brands should not make that mistake that everybody is speaking and understanding and consuming content in English language. And again, that's what it is, right? The complexity of even the digital ecosystem with the number of
right,
platforms, the languages that you need to cater to, the supply chain, which acts very differently every part of the world.
right,
Today, if you want to do a supply chain to hilly regions or northeast regions, it's a very different ballgame, right?
Right.
do a supply chain to Northeast, a supply chain to the tier two towns.
Right.
Very, very different, right? UP, you need to take care of different aspects of supply chain versus Maharashtra. It kind of has its own nuances, and
Right.
you need to be able to cater to those needs.
You know, I I think that's still a very predictable piece, right? I mean, supply chain is something that you can optimize. I think, I'm more. I think the entire demand side is extremely interesting, right? Nitin, you mentioned about our the regionality that exists, right? And there are many regions, right, that exist, right? And I think we have a very famous saying, right? Coast per pani batle char coast pe bani, right? Which is very typical of India, right? That every couple of miles, the language kind of changes, right? And that's the beauty of this market, right? So we are making it a very India focused conversation right now, right? Because I think we're essentially a very large market, right? The last billion people market, and have the aspiration, right? And I'm going to come to the global part as well, right? Nitin, one thing that has happened, right? I mean, you alluded to Bharat, right? And I think Bharat is a very interesting subset, right, of the larger India that exists, right? Like you said, 98% of e-commerce is still happening, or 98% of commerce is still happening in a very offline way, and the language preference is essentially very local, so on and so forth, right? I have a thesis on content, right, and in entertainment, right? In entertainment, more is more, right? You don't necessarily build an affinity to it, right? But what it does is it just brings you a very different kind of an exposure. Now, what has happened is during this time, especially because all of us were in lockdown, right? Nobody was essentially going out. The only thing that was constant was consumption of content, right? Irrespective of whatever content people were consuming, they were consuming, Hindi content, local language content, English content, whoever could consume whatever, right? Now, what it did was it brought in a very different kind of an aspiration, right? One, understanding it sort of gave them exposure. Second, it brought in aspiration, right? Where people now wanted to buy and choose to what they can, right? Of course, there were supply chain issues that were getting sorted, which will possibly get rectified much faster than we anticipate. uh, but one thing which is a big problem in an area like that, right, when we're talking about a market like India, is a low saving space, right? So on one hand you have aspiration, on the other hand you have a low saving space, right? And Bharat especially again has other challenges, which are a low digital footprint, which essentially means that many companies will not be able to give them the kind of credit, right, which is very important for a D2C growth, right? What do you make out of this uh, complexity that exists in a very large part of India, right? How do you see this being either an obstacle or an opportunity for many D2C brands take off, right? I mean, you alluded to the possibility of brands thriving on niche-like infrastructure, right? But a low savings base is something that you can really do nothing about, and it's more to do with the policy level, right? And I think the money percolating down the economy. What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, so look, we all of us again make a separate mistake of saying, all the D2C brands needs to be aspirational. I think there are a lot of utilitarian brands as well,
Sure. Okay.
and there are a lot of problems. Very simple thing, right? Gluten is a big problem
Mhm.
in India. Very few people regularly recognize it, but you
Right.
will find large pockets of India where gluten is challenging. People,
Right.
kids cannot consume gluten. When you want to go and build a gluten-free, buy something, there will be somebody sitting in some part of the country supplying whatever quality
Sure.
unbranded gluten product, which you're not even sure
Right.
about, right? Is there a demand for a gluten-free product, right? There is a demand, there's a need. It's not just aspiration,
Mhm.
there is a need, right?
Right.
PCOS, it's a real problem. Diabetes, it's a real problem. So there are a lot of brands, not just from an aspirational perspective, but I think utilitarian perspective, there
Right.
is a lot of unfulfilled demand from a customer perspective. Coming to aspiration, I think we always underestimate the consumption power of India.
Right.
Again, we are touching 2% of the population. There is a 90% of population which is there, and the the investment on the aspiration on the consumption for the basic consumption and need, I think is fairly high.
Mhm.
Not everybody will continue to consume content in English.
Mhm.
I think there is an affinity that needs to be created for that local language. I'll give you a very simple product, right? From a
Sure.
product example. Butterfly is a great company on mixer
Mhm.
grinder, but their anchor product on Butterfly is the wet grinder, and wet
Right.
grinder will only sold in South, right? A
Okay.
North Indian company will never have created that product,
Right.
and it's literally they rule the roost, right? So
Mhm.
there are a lot of aspirational, need-driven convenience product that India continues to need
Right.
across the segment, across the strata. And as long as brands understand that, they will unique need of the consumer, rather than just saying, build an aspirational brand which do not have utility in view. I think that will not succeed. So there needs to be aspiration, there needs to be a utility, and I think India provides a large enough market for that.
Fantastic. Then I have another question, which is more on experiential, right? I think when you start looking at e-commerce majors, right? I mean, all of these are looking at some sort of physical infrastructure, right? For various reasons, but I think touch and feel is a very important play. When it comes to a market which has lesser educational base, right? I mean, of course, we are working on it, right? I mean, education is a big priority, but we're still a very touch and feel market, right? Decision making is still very touch and feel dependent, right? And that's largely because of the trust deficit. For the D2C brand, it becomes all the more uh, uh, high, right? Because everything that you do essentially has to be built in a digital format, right? Uh, do you think this is a misnomer, or do you think eventually house of brands independently will have to create a layer of experiential, right, where people can actually go out, experience certain, uh, if not the complete product range, but say some products, right, to build that at least that initial trust which is required for them to go out and further consume. What are your thoughts on that particular bit? And that's a constant, by the way, across the country.
Three interesting aspects.
Sure.
First of all, the trust, right? India, in general, on an e-commerce, I think there is a very high trust which is generated.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I would say in some categories there is a larger trust on a commerce platform than even the physical platform.
Right.
Today, if I were to product Amazon, Flipkart, there is a greater trust saying, let me buy it from Amazon because their customer service is amazing. I can go and
Right.
return the products, and the bill will always be there in digital. I don't need to store the physical bill
Right.
and do something 6 months. Something will happen, and people say, "Acha, sir, physical copy dikhao." India does not require that,
Right.
right? So, in fact, in some categories, I would say the trust on the digital ecosystem is much higher than even offline ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
The trust on the whole review rating system, I think, is extremely high. Today, you want to try new restaurants, as long as it has 4 stars and certain number of stars.
Right.
I think intuitively the customer mind is switching from looking at the star, looking at the rating. So that ecosystem of trust is already there. There's a huge ecosystem of trust which is there on the payments, especially on the large platforms. I think banks have done a wonderful job in
Right.
this entire ecosystem, which wasn't there 10 years ago. So
Mm-hmm.
from a brand perspective, I don't think trust is an important factor to build that offline ecosystem. I think
Right.
offline ecosystem is more required where they want to have a greater reach. As we said, there is only a percentage of people which will only start coming online, and they will happen at a certain pace. But as brands want to expand to greater and greater and larger number of customers, they need to be able to provide that access to the customer. It's important for the brand to be able to be available at all points of presence where the customer is. And I think that is an important aspect. I won't go by the trust aspect. I think trust on the online ecosystem is become and continuously becoming fairly big and fairly large. I mean, it's literally the e-commerce ecosystem which sustained India, which quote unquote fed India, food delivery, everything, when everything was shut down, right?
Right.
Offline, everything was shut down, and it's online companies and delivery companies which literally did a marvelous job. So I think trust is there in the ecosystem. It's more, not everybody is may have gone into a digital payment, but given the UPI, I think people are comfortable making digital payments. So it's part of the learning of the ecosystem. But I would say offline will remain. And if you want to build a large sustainable play, you have to have your strategy clear at saying at what point of time do you want to touch offline, at what point of time which offline stores you need to be play with. So there has to be a complete different strategy in terms of offline and experience than online. But I think the first product market fit test in online is far more easier, far more quicker, and that has to be the bed of innovation.
Right. Very interesting. Then, my other question is, right, I think, which is also, is uh, essentially my effort to understand more about, the way you want to play this market, right? Which are the sectors that you are, for example, particularly focused on, right? I mean, D2C is, I mean, today when we talk of D2C, I think there is this, pretty much everything which is now kind of happening under D2C, right? So there's a lot of work which you're seeing in wellness and well-being, right, which is happening, health, which is happening, right? The entire cosmetic space, for example, is kind of is shaped up beautifully, right? We've seen some amazing brands that have come out, right? And the valuations have kind of soared beautifully, right? Because consumers have been able to, go out, procure them, purchase them, right, and they come back. There's a huge, retention which is being built in the process, right? Would love to understand from you, right, in terms of global bees, which are the key, sectors that you're looking at within the D2C possibility?
Well, we are not we kind of sector agnostic. I think we are looking at a more of a characteristics of a product and a
Okay.
characteristics of a sector. And there are a couple of things that we look at.
Mhm.
We need sector or segments where there is a sustainable and a repeat purchase.
Right.
There is a certain duration of SKU, for
Mhm.
example, right?
Right.
We're not going into a sector where a SKU needs to be developed every 3 months to even stay at the same place, right?
Mhm.
So there are certain theses, and because of those theses, certain products or certain categories become natural to us, and certain categories that we are avoiding at this point of time. But
Okay.
for us, it's sustainable, repeat consumption, high length of the SKU, and a SKU having a global demand and a global adaptability. Very easy are some of the principles that we go by, rather than saying we will do this category or not do that category.
Very interesting. Nitin, we've seen the kind of the event of liquidity, right? I mean, which has been unlike any other event that we've seen, I think, in many years. And I think, like I said, at India being the last, billion people market, right? I think a lot of that liquidity is essentially being channelized, right? Now, one thing that has happened is that, of course, is I mean, is elating, right? And I think everybody, each of us, is extremely happy about this entire movement, right? Because this is a reflection of a very renewed kind of a confidence, right? In an economy like India, which I think was only a fringe play, right, for many larger funds, right? But what this liquidity has essentially done is that it's just disturbed the entire, CAC to LTV ratios, right, for many brands. The kind of monies that are being spent to acquire a customer are absolutely bizarre, right? I mean, the burns are unjustifiable, right? We really, like I said, we're completely off what was, what otherwise was a benchmark, right? What do you make out of, a situation like this? I mean, do you think it's a short-lived play which is going to eventually normalize as we go along, or do you think, this is going to set in because of the kind of spends that we're making? It's going to set in a very different kind of an expectation in the minds of the consumer, right? And he or she will eventually seek that kind of a response and resonance, right? And engagement. Uh, will we be able to move to sustainability? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, see, look, it's a demand supply curve when you talk about CAC. But
Sure.
if you look at capital perspective, I think yes, there has been liquidity for various reasons. But at the same time, I think the more and more investments or return avenues across the world are fairly limited. I think credit markets are extremely helpful for brands to grow. I think credit costs are fairly reasonable across the world. So the returns in the world have been challenged in the past, right?
Hmm.
And I think the startup is providing a great opportunity for investors across the globe. And literally, the money will flow in where the returns will come. So I think that is a great play. Coming to a CAC and cost of CAC, yes, we've seen the CACs going high, but it's literally a demand supply curve.
Hmm.
We will see the survival of the fittest. I remember, the front page of Times of India costing bunkers 5 years ago. It's probably not the same cost, right? So
Right.
ultimately, it's a demand supply, and I think that demand supply will normalize
Right.
as we go along. However, we have always also seen some great brands, even who are doing 2 million or 3 million, being profitable, extremely
Right.
profitable, while people are complaining on the CAC. So I think it's important that people understand the growth marketing very deeply. It's become a
Hmm.
very sophisticated industry. It's no more that you can go and run the ad and get the cheapest CAC. I think the tail keywords have become very interesting. What sort of technology you have, what sort
Right.
of depth of technology. You can't do high level marketing with a mediocre agency and saying I'm getting returns. So most of the
Right.
things where we are seeing the complaints of high CACs are literally people who have not understood the depth of digital marketing. I think that is very important. I think digital marketing has become extremely complex science, extremely high data driven science, and you need to be able to first understand that infrastructure, then create that infrastructure, and then leverage it. You are literally getting 100 insights every day. Do you have the ecosystem and technology and platform to be able to cater to that insight every day? And I think that's the crux of it. I'll take an example of we call it a Sheen model, right?
Mhm.
Literally, Sheen is not in India currently, but what they do is basically insights of a customer globally to say what pattern has started to do uptrend today,
Right.
and then being able to bring out that product quickly in a week to cater to that customer demand. Now that's
Mhm.
part of the growth, and when you
Right.
adopt that kind of strategy, it's cheap. You are able to get the product out to the market, and you are able to build a profitable business. It's
Right.
very simple. Onion shampoo became very popular, right? But we all knew about onion shampoo becoming popular only 6 months and 12 months after it had become popular, where a
Right.
good marketer knew it on a week one and a week two. And
Right.
that's really what makes the difference, right? So if you're doing a me too product, if you're not catering to a customer demand, yes, that is true. And that's where you need more and more sophistication for your marketing efforts as well.
Interesting. Nitin, we're towards the end of the conversation, right? Last two questions. Uh, you know, uh, when you look at the D2C ecosystem, right? Especially when you're looking at Instagram, I think which has kind of exploded in many, many ways, right? I think it's become a marquee platform, right? For many of the founders of D2C brands to actually go out and say advertise, talk, right, create content. It's kind of literally democratized it, right? So from a very institutionalized structure, it's kind of let people break it and do it DIY, right? In many many ways, right? Now, what is happening, and I think one thing which is a constant across many D2C founders, right, is essentially their own problems that they were working to sort out, right. In the process, they discovered a possibility, which now they've kind of packaged in a brand, right. My personal belief is we're going to see 100,000 brands that are going to come up, right, and they're not necessarily going to be large brands. They're going to be more splinter groups, like, right. They're going to be very very small. They're going to cater to just about say few thousand customers, right. They're going to be operating out of a much smaller setup, right? But they will create a huge problem, for very large brands, right? For larger ships. What D2C, for example, has done to the HULs of the world, right? Will possibly start to also happen to larger institutionalized portfolios, right? Uh, what do you think about that, right? And these are groups, and these are niches that are not going to go on to become very very large, right? They will always have a transitioning audience, right, which will be catered to in a certain form and way, but they're going to have an extremely high loyalty, something that I alluded to right at the start as well, right, of a conversation. They're going to be extremely profitable, and they might not fit the thesis like the one you have, right? They'll still be very very small in terms of the kind of revenues that they create, but many of them across portfolios will become a huge problem, right? What do you think of that, right? Do you think the consumer is going to be, uh, how is the consumer going to react to an environment like that? What are your thoughts about that, and how do you see that play out?
I think consumer doesn't react to these environments. Consumer literally goes to saying, I like this product, I like that value proposition, I'm going to buy. He's not
Sure.
thinking anymore that this is a HLL product or this is an Amazon product or a Flipkart product.
Right.
He looks at the product utility, he looks at the product reviews, he looks at the brand engagement, gains the
Right.
trust, and buys the product. And I
Right.
think that's a great strength for the new brands, because
Mhm.
no more you need that brand name of big house, a Tata or a Godesh, for
Right.
customer to say I will
Right.
trust these brands versus I can't trust a new brand. I think
Right.
that ecosystem is changing. Although Tata is a great name, they still exuberate huge amount of trust anything that comes from there. But I think it just gives that opportunity for the new brands to continue to emerge, and that's what will continue to happen. So customer won't think about it. I think from the brand's ecosystem, it will be very important that you yourself do not become like a large company who has stopped innovating. I
Right.
think innovation and a continuous innovation will be the key, and it will depend on how platforms cater to those innovations. Those innovations can be done in-house. Those innovations can be done through the roll-ups and continuous partnering, acquisition with
Right.
some of these emerging brands. I think continue to have a focus, which I alluded to my growth conversation as well.
Right.
How deep insight, a customer insight, a data driven insight that you're doing on a customer trend, and being able to cater to that demand by a product, whether you innovate it yourself, whether you buy a innovation, whether you partner a innovation, will be the key to build out a sustainable platform. And I think that is something as a fundamental, uh, the that will become the fundamental of any sustainable company in the digital era. And that has
Interesting.
happened, right? We've seen large companies not being able to continue that innovation and do not exist today. So I think innovation is the key, and how you continuously innovate, whether you do in-house, whether you do it outside your ecosystem, whether you partner with the ecosystem. I think that's going to be important. And if you do not have an ecosystem or a platform where you are daily getting that insights of innovation, I think you will have a challenge.
Very interesting. Nitin, this has been an absolutely phenomenal conversation. I've had the opportunity of understanding D2C in many ways, right? And I think, this conversation is giving me a reflection of both sides, right? When you're looking from one side and when you're looking at somebody who's, building like a house of brands, right? And many, many brands eventually to be housed, right? And I think in that context, I think it's been an absolutely phenomenal conversation, right? Something we did not cover, which I would have loved to cover a little more thoroughly, and which we'll possibly do across many other upcoming conversations with you, Nitin, is your global aspiration, right? So if you can quickly sort of give me a glimpse of, what's the global aspiration, right? What are some of the things that we're going to see in, say, next 2 years at GlobalBees, right? In terms of, say, taking, brands that you've invested in into international markets, possibly, bringing in some brands internationally that exist into India markets, right? What are we going to see in the next 2 years?
Yeah, so we're creating both corridors. We call it
Right.
these international corridors,
Mm-hmm.
both inward corridors and outward corridors of the brands to be able to play into both ecosystem.
Right.
And as I said earlier, I think it's very interesting today, given that India is a manufacturing hub for a lot of things, right? When you look at textiles, when you look at foods, when you look at pharma
Right.
or associated OTC, India is a great manufacturing hub.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it will unleash the potential of the Indian brands coming from Indian manufacturers to be able to take global. And that's literally what we are creating. We'll create that. We already have some bits of those highways in some of the geographies.
Right.
But essentially, what we see in the next 3 years, creating large global ecosystem to be able to kind of input the brands. And India has already shown that. If you look at Godrej, right, they have
Right.
a large FMCG business in Africa, for example. If you look at Wipro Consumer, they have a large FMCG business in Southeast Asia.
Right.
So these plays already exist. It's not something new, but these are still kind of niches. And I think we will see that animal spirit being unleashed on these global expansion by Indian brands and
Right.
Indian innovation. And that's what we are here to do.
I like the way you put it. I like the way you put it, right? Uh, Nitin, my last question, right? Founders in India have matured in a very different way, right? But like I said, D2C is a fairly new area. We are in very uncharted territories, right? From a consumer preference standpoint, because the nature of influence has completely changed. It's very difficult environment, right? In many, many ways. What do you think are some of the key characteristics of great founders? Because you are in the job of identifying great horses, right? People who are building great brands, who are going to be running those brands, right, as you go along, and can focus on that passion, right, and channelize their energy, right. And also a word of advice, right, for many aspirants who are in the D2C, who are working hard to build great brands in the D2C space, right? What will that be?
Actually, primarily we just look at one key characteristics of founder.
Sure.
How in-depth knowledge of the customer and the category and the customer need that the founder has. I
Right.
think what it requires, rest is operation, right?
Right.
To be honest.
Right.
But ability to understand a customer need, ability to create a product which satisfy that unique need is
Mm-hmm.
very, very important. I think the depth of the knowledge of a founder in the category that he's building and the insights of the customer is the key insight that we look for with respect to the founder, because that literally tells you customer obsession of the founder, and
Right.
that's for us.
Right.
Otherwise, you can create opportunistic business, right? Today XYZ is in a short supply, I have an inventory, I can pump an inventory and build a
Right.
$1 million in couple of dollars without an insight, and then you will go on to sell something else next day.
Right.
I think that's something. I think it's important that founder has a great customer understanding, the great ecosystem understanding, and is catering to that demand. And that's literally the key characteristics. I think we take care of the growth, we take care of the supply chain, we take care of the logistics, technology, XYZ. So that's the most important perspective in terms of when we look at the brand or a founder, because only a founder with a great insight and a customer passion is able to build a great brand. He positions it rightly, he prices it rightly, he formulates it nicely. Every aspect, I think the customer obsession is the one key point we look at.
Super. Nitin, how I want, like many of my other conversations, right? I mean, how I want this conversation to go on, right? Like I said, I think India is an extremely complex market, but a very interesting market, right? And to have somebody like who's taking that bets, right? You want the conversation to go on, right? You don't want to bring the conversation to a close because, like I said, there are many nuances, very minor aspects which actually go on to define the market, right? And these are interesting times. I mean, the times couldn't have been better to be building a category. But I'm going to reserve a lot of my questions that I had for you, Nitin, for our upcoming conversations, right? But listen, it was a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you so much for taking the time out. I thoroughly enjoyed this
It
conversation. I'm
was,
sure there's so much for people to watch this.
absolutely, and it was a pleasure. And I can just make a pitch saying any founder who's passionate about delivering a value to the customer
Right.
and does not like 90% of his job interviewing people and setting up all this nonsense, I think GlobalBees is the right partner for you. We are here to build a great ecosystem. We are here to build a great consumer company, and we're loving what you're doing.
Super. Nitin, thank you so much for taking the time. I look forward to having you with us very soon.
Thank you, Ashu. It was wonderful chatting with you. Brilliant.